Good morning. I'm George LeMieux, Chairman of the Board of the Gunster Law Firm, and I'm privileged to be here today with Steve Leveen. Steve is the founder of the company LeMieux, which is a great success story in Florida, but also he is the author of the book America Bilingual and a proponent for bilingualism in this country. We're pleased to have you come on Gunster's View from the Top. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Senator LeMieux. What a pleasure to be here.
So great to have you. Thank you for what you've done in Florida by building a great business. I want to talk to you about business here in the state, but I first want to talk to you about this passion that you've acquired for bilingualism and the importance it has, not just for kids, but for adults in our country. Well, what got you interested in the bilingual movement?
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because about 12 years ago, I started studying Spanish pretty seriously, and people said the weirdest things to me. At least I thought they were weird. Like, why bother? The whole world speaks English. Or why bother? Technology is going to make language learning obsolete. We're going to have these gizmos in our ears to do instant translation. Or they would say the only way to learn a language is total immersion, implying that whatever I might be doing was a waste of time. But plenty of other people came up to me and said, oh my gosh, I really want to learn Italian or French or Mandarin or whatever it is. How are you doing it? And for some reason, they always whisper to me. I'm not quite sure why, but so that got me interested actually in my very first career right out of graduate school was as a science writer, a science journalist. And I really enjoyed that work, but I left that to go into business and started a business with my wife, which fortunately is still around. I resigned as CEO back in 2014, and now Margaret Morosky is running that company very well. And so it freed me to kind of go back in my encore career, as they say, to go back to my very first career as a journalist. So I went back to school. I spent a fellowship year at Harvard and then another fellowship year at Stanford, designed for executives moving on to their next gig in life. And I was able to interview some of the top scholars and linguists, social linguists, language teachers, and hundreds of successful bilinguals and monolinguals. And the more I learned, the more interested I got. And it's not so much that I'm promoting bilingualism, although I am. It's more that I've reporting on a big change in this country that most people are unaware of, and that is the huge growth in bilingualism that really kind of snuck up on us. It started in the 1970s when because of Immigration Reform Acts in the 60s, they ramped up in the late 60s, so the 1970s began the third wave of American immigration. And these immigrants, in most ways, are identical to prior generations of immigrants, but in one way different. And that is, our narrative in America is that, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents came to this country and they were patriotic and they eagerly abandoned their heritage languages and didn't teach them to their children. I'm sure they were very patriotic. They were also very practical. And before the 1960s, the likelihood of you going back to the home country on a steamship was very low and very expensive. Communication technology of the day were handwritten letters. And the United States, before 1950 really, was a national, most of the enterprises were national, not global. And contrast that with what happened starting in the 1960s. Jet travel, communication technology continued to evolve dramatically into what we have today. So today's immigrants also patriotic, but they're practical. And today they're saying, you know what, we can maintain our heritage language. Not only is it practical to do so, but it's beneficial to do so. We know our children will have better career prospects, better job offers, if they can speak the home language and English perfectly. And it's not just immigrant parents, it's native born parents who are realizing the same thing. We were talking a few minutes ago about your your own son who just finished high school and is a Mandarin speaker.
Yeah, it's a great, I think, talent for him. And what I like, what you've written in your book too, America Bilingual, about the fact about brain development. I think there's some cultural awareness benefits of being able to think and speak in a different language, plus the natural affinity I think it brings to people of the culture to the language that they've learned. So I really applaud your efforts. And I wanted you to talk about that issue about brain development, because you focused on that on your book. And a lot of us, as we get older, we think about what are we going to continue to do to stay stimulated and keep our brains working and being high functioning as we get older. What does foreign language do for us in that equation?
Yeah. Well, there's been a ton of research dedicated to the advantages or disadvantages of bilingualism on the developing child, and then throughout the whole lifespan. So actually, before the 1960s, the science of the day contended that raising children bilingually was actually bad for them. Not until the 1960s that a couple of Canadian researchers get involved and do the research, and they kind of turned all that on its head, and they say, we were doing the science wrong. We got to improve how we were sampling, et cetera. So since the 1960s, there's been thousands, literally, of articles written by cognitive psychologists trying to explore this question. So I could sum up all the research by saying there is absolutely no evidence of any detriment in child development and brain development from bilingualism. There is evidence of all kinds of positive things, and particularly, oddly enough, at the later years in life, there's another Canadian researcher named Bialystock, and she's demonstrated that bilinguals, there seems to be a benefit of postponing the symptoms of Alzheimer's by 4 or 5 years, which clearly is a good thing. So yes, learning a language, which by the way, you can do at any age. One of the myths that I challenge in my book is it's not just for children. Adults of any age can learn a new language. And using it in your daily life is a joy, is a challenge, and is a benefit cognitively.
Thank you for that. And tell us a little bit about, as a guy who built a business here in Florida, and in Florida being such a multilingual state, perhaps one of the most multilingual, multicultural states in the country, what is the benefit for business owners of having bilingual team members?
Yeah, well, there's an expression I came across in my research, which is if you want to buy something, you can do that in your language. If you want to sell something, you can probably finish that sentence. It sure helps to do it in the language of your customer. And that's what so many businesses in America are doing today, global businesses, if they're trying to sell internationally. And I don't mean just selling things, but selling ideas in development work, in medicine, in law, in whatever the field is. If you're trying to persuade, if you're trying to not just compete, but if you're trying to collaborate internationally, can you do it in English? Yes, you can. But it's kind of like showing up at the major leagues with your shoes tied together. Unless you or members of your team are functional in the culture of those countries and the languages of those countries, you're just not operating at a professional basis. And I think many companies recognize that, and they're hiring bilinguals. It's sometimes a struggle to find qualified bilinguals to hire, but the companies that succeed at that are at a competitive advantage internationally.
Well, Florida is such a large state in terms of exporting. We're one of the leading exporting states in the country, so certainly that would make sense for us. In closing, we've got some policy leaders who watch these broadcasts, and I was wondering if, based upon your research and your advocacy, if you have any suggestions for our policy leaders as what they can do to foster bilingualism in our society.
Yep. It's a great question. Florida has been a leader in dual language education. We were talking just a few minutes ago about the Coral Way School in Miami, which started in the 1960s in response to the Operation Pedro Pan, when all the children came from Cuba. Everybody thought it was going to be temporary, and the kids would go back to Cuba, so we have to keep teaching them in Spanish. But then we thought, well, we should teach them English too, and let's mix in American kids, so it'll all be good. And guess what? It worked. It worked really well, and the school is still going on. So Florida can be proud of the fact that we were the kind of Kitty Hawk of dual language school in America, which has been growing tremendously. Now there's much more demand for parents to place their children in dual language schools than there is supply of those schools. There's states that are leading in dual language schools are Utah and North Carolina. So I think policymakers that can enhance more dual language schools in the state are doing a great thing for the citizens if they can do that. Florida did adopt the seal of biliteracy. So high school kids like your own son can achieve that seal of biliteracy in English and another language. So that's a very positive thing. So I would say there's tons of good news going on. It's important that Americans recognize it and see our linguistic capital for the great strength it is. And I think policymakers have an important role to play in promoting that and making Florida one of the leading states in the country.
Steve, thank you so much. Steve Leveen, author of America Bilingual. Thank you for being on Gunster's View from the Top. Thank you for building a great business in our state. Thank you for being a longtime Gunster client. We're grateful to you and look forward to seeing you again soon.
It's a real pleasure.